In this video, we're going to have a look at a series of frequent mistakes that students tend to make when writing tasks at C1 level, the kind of mistakes that are not supposed to be happening at this level. To start with, I'll discuss the position of the word also, which is basically the same as you would use with any adverb of frequency, for example. So if you remember the rule, the word also should go when you have just one verb, just one word as a verb, it goes before the verb. That's why you would say something like, she works very hard, but she also goes to the gym. Just one word as a verb, and then also goes before that. She also goes. She also likes. I also like. When you have a two-word verb, when you have, for example, modal verbs or perfect tenses, when you have, for example, good like, then the word also goes in the middle. Or when you say, I can also do. In this example, I would also like to add that, blah, blah, whatever. And then, for example, you can find this word in an expression which you tend to use very frequently and which is okay. Not only, but also. Okay, it is true that this is the expression, but if you have a verb, then the position needs to change. So you could say something like, hitting a child is not only immoral, but it is also illegal. Why? Because also, as any other adverb of frequency, well, it's not an adverb of frequency, but it goes in the same position as adverbs of frequency, goes after the verb to be. Okay? So, it could go before a main verb, in the middle of these two verbs, or if it is the verb to be, always after the verb to be. Second frequent mistake is the preposition you need to use after the verb think. You have two possibilities. You can either use think of or think about, but these are the only two options you can actually use. So you could say something like, what do you think about the latest plans to curb the spread of the virus, to stop the spread of the virus? Okay, so that would be, what is your opinion about? What do you think about? So this is what you use here. Okay? Or when you say things such as, with this in mind, let us think for a moment about the consequences of such a move, of such a decision. So again, with this in mind, let us think about the consequences of such a move. Sometimes when you are considering options, you can use both about or of. You could both say, I'm thinking about moving to a smaller town, or I'm thinking of moving to a smaller town. Both are correct. Or for example, this is something teachers do very frequently. When you ask your students to remember something, you could say, can anyone think of the name of a first dog that went into space? Can anyone think of, or can you think of an example of? So this is what you would say here. Can you think of? But as I say, these are the only two prepositions you can actually use. I have noticed that many of you are actually using the word reckon as a synonym of think in many of your writings, in many of your written tasks. That might be okay in a very informal context. If you're writing an email to a friend, that could be okay. But if you have to write a letter to your boss, a letter to the minister, a letter to the editor, a report, any type of text that involves formality, I would advise you against using it, okay? Because as I say, it's an informal, it's a synonym of think, but it's really informal. So please don't use it if the tone required by the text type is somehow formal, or even in a formal presentation. In speaking, in an interaction with a colleague or friend, it could be okay. But if you have to present, and for example, in some of your exams, you have to carry out a formal presentation, then I would advise you against using it. You can watch this fragment from a very recent TV show where these two colleagues and friends use this word. But as I say, this is a fairly informal context. Students of mine know that I have a sort of personal crusade against the use of I think, especially in writing or even sometimes in speaking. If you have to speak, if you have to produce at C1 or definitely at C2 levels, I mean, I think it's absolutely correct and it's used widely by every speaker. However, because you need to show your range of language, please don't stick to I think. Show your teachers, show your examiners that your range of language is wider than that. So you have lots of many other options, plenty of them. I feel that stricter measures should be put into place. I believe not enough is being done. In my view, in my opinion, more stringent measures should be implemented. Or as I see it, great effort is required. You have millions of possibilities, so please try and show your range of language. Be careful with the verb recommend, because what comes after it is important. You can simply recommend something that is a noun. For example, the report recommends a cut in the number of full-time paid staff. But this is what they recommend, a cut, a noun. Okay. Something which you tend to use is having a verb after recommend. Perfectly all right, but then be careful. Some doctors recommend putting a board under the mattress. If you have back pain, for example, some doctors recommend putting in the ing, a verb in the ing, not in any other way. Okay? If you have to use a sentence after recommend with subject and verb, that is possible. However, this is a somehow strange pattern. You could say something like, the report recommended that, okay, criminal charges, and be careful now, be brought. An infinitive, which is a very strange thing because you actually have a subject. But this is because this is a very ancient structure. This is very old in the history of the English language. So anyway, this is what you would say, that criminal charges be brought. Or the doctor recommended that he stay at home. Again, with an infinitive. I know it sounds strange, but this is a sort of exception with the verb recommend. Very frequent mistake, especially so when you, for example, if you have to mediate a text, many times you will find a list of tips. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9 tips, this is what you get. You have either 10 tips or you may have 10 pieces of advice, okay, which is not that frequent, but typically you have tips. Top tips on how to, whatever. Top tips on how to lose weight. Top tips on how to succeed at exams. Things like that. Because the word advice is an uncountable word. You can't use a number and then the word advice, and it doesn't have a plural. So you could say things like, these are some tips for decorating a small flat. Or, The nutritionist will provide practical advice and helpful tips on how to eat healthily. This is probably an expression you will find. Tips on how to do something, or tips for doing something. If you want to talk in a general way, you could use the word advice, that's all right. However, you would say, let me give you some advice. Okay? It's a singular word, it is uncountable, so you could use something like some before it, but you can't use a number, and you can't use it in the plural, definitely not. Okay? So if you are really, really keen on using the word advice in the plural, what you would have to say could be something like, that's just one example of many pieces of advice. And this is what you would have in the plural, pieces of advice. Okay? So for example, I'm thinking of a mediation exercise. If you have a series of recommendations, you could say, the first tip or the first piece of advice is to blah, 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 whatever. Okay? I tend to use this word, but both are okay. A furlough scheme is the equivalent of the Spanish ERTE. Okay? So if you think of that, you could say that the furlough scheme will affect the economy. Remember that you use this verb here, and then this is the object, and there's no preposition involved. It will affect the economy. Or if you want, the economy will be affected, with a nice passive sentence. Okay? You could also say that the furlough scheme will have an effect on the economy, will have an effect on something. Or the furlough scheme will have an impact on the economy. More frequent mistakes, for example, the expressions conscious or aware. You can be conscious or you can be aware of something. You can be aware that something is happening, for example. Okay? So you could say things such as, we need to be conscious of the hardships some households are facing, of the difficulties that some families are facing. Or we need to be aware of the hardships that some households are facing. If you want to use a sentence after aware, that's perfectly possible. And you could say, we need to be aware that some households are not able to make ends meet. However, sometimes you may need to change people's awareness, change people's information about something. So, in that case, you use the verb make. So you make people aware of something, or you need to make people aware that, and then subject and verb. Finally, sometimes there seems to be some confusion with care, take care, be careful, something like that. When you say to somebody something like, I care about you, it means something like, I worry about you, you are important to me. Something like that. So if you care about the environment is important to you. You're worried and it's an important issue in your life or in your worldview somehow. That is not the same as when you say, at the moment I'm taking care of my grandmother, or we need to take care of our environment. Okay? And sometimes I have a feeling that you use this expression or something similar when you actually mean be careful. That would be the equivalent of our ten cuidado, cuida con, because there is danger. Okay? So be careful with that knife. It's dangerous. Be careful with that knife. Or be careful with what you say. Or be careful with him. He's dangerous. Okay? But sometimes I have a feeling that there might be some confusion between these two structures. If you take care of somebody, you look after somebody or something. So this was just a selection of some of the most frequent mistakes that I could find these days while correcting writing tasks. I hope you have found this useful at all.